We got a lot to cover. No jokes today. Welcome to February 2021. This is the 76th episode of the Paperback Warrior Podcast.
Welcome to the Paperback Warrior Podcast. My name is Eric, and I'm here with my broadcast partner, Tom. Paperback Warrior is the internet's finest resource for reviews and discussion of mid-20th century paperback fiction in nearly every genre. The specialties of the house are crime, adventure, western, and spy fiction, with a sprinkling of sleaze, horror, and science fiction from time to time. The podcast is an outgrowth of our blog at paperbackwarrior.com, where we post daily reviews of all these old books. Let me throw it over to Tom, who's going to tell us what's happening on today's show.
All right, so today's feature is going to be about a prolific author of genre fiction named Ralph Hayes, who did a lot of work in the action, adventure, and western genres, both in his own name and under a variety of pseudonyms. For our reviews, I'm going to be telling you about a 1954 standalone novel by Donald Hamilton called Nightwalker. Sorry, I don't know why I call you Erica. What is your review today?
I'm going to be reviewing They All Ran Away by Edward S. Ahrens. He's a guy we don't really cover that much here, so I'm happy to talk about.
Yeah, we need to remedy that because he's kind of a big deal.
Yeah, he's a big deal, so I'm excited to talk about that. And before we do the feature, though, you've got some odds and ends you want to talk about, right?
Yes, I'm running down a history of an author, and I find myself in a bit of a cul-de-sac as far as trying to figure out who he was. Let me hand this over to you. I'm just finished this book from 1953 called Masquerade into Madness. It's a standalone Fawcett Gold Medal paperback, and the author is listed as Russ Meservey, Meservey. It's got a nice enough cover, but it's never been reprinted or reviewed in any online forum. The book is a first-person hard-boiled noir about a Skid Row bar fighter named Barney Nash. When the book opens, he's in a jail cell, really more of a drunk tank, in Manhattan after getting drunk and kicking someone's ass in a tavern. He meets this lawyer named Jardine who gets Barney out of jail, and Jardine puts Barney up to conning money from an addled old lady by pretending to be her son. Now, I read the book. The writing's very good. It's pretty much in this first-person kind of tough guy, hard-boiled style. The problem I'm having, and you regular listeners to the show will recognize this pathology, is that I don't know much about the author, and it's driving me crazy. Anytime I read a book, I want to know if it's a pseudonym or a real guy, what city he's from, what else did he write, is he dead, what's his favorite breakfast cereal, did he prefer boxers or briefs? I need to know it all. I'm wondering, Eric, do you have the same illness?
I know what you're talking about, and I don't have a desperate need for a prescription like you do, but I do have a mild case of that sickness because here's the thing. I want to know who the author is so I can sort of gauge the quality of the book compared to what the author normally produces. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, totally.
Okay.
All right, so this one's a little different. I'll tell you what I do know about Russ Meservey. First, this is his only novel. There's no indication that he ever wrote another book, at least not one listed in any resource, and I checked everything I have. Second, he is not a pseudonym, nor did he write books under any known pseudonym. Now, I thought I had a promising lead when I found a pulp magazine writer also named Russ Meservey, who wrote a few dozen stories for the Airplane pulps, magazines like Airplane Stories, War Aces, and Sky Riders. Now, the Airplane pulp guy's first story was The Dill Pickle That Flies, from the April 1929 issue of Air Adventures. He also wrote some nonfiction aeronautic articles in early 1929. The bulk of his work, though, was between 1930 and 1935, when he also wrote for Dime Detective. The last pulp story I could find by this guy was called The Pylon Pirate from Ace Sports in August 1940. So if it's the same dude, we're to believe that he went dormant for 13 years, including throughout the entire 1940s, and then resurfaced again in 1953 to author this single novel, Masquerade into Madness, for Fawcett Gold Medal, and then never to be heard from again. Another breadcrumb for me, as far as trying to learn about this guy, was the obituary of a lady from Wisconsin who just died back in November 2020. Now, her name was Lucille Meservey, and she was 87 years old. In her obituary, it said that she married Russell Meservey in Minnesota in 1956. It doesn't say anything about her husband's career, but it mentions that she and Russell used to like to go fishing on her boat, camping, and being outdoors. They eventually retired together on a lake in Wisconsin until Russell died back in 1994. So, Eric, here we go, down the rabbit hole. I did some public record searches and found that Lucille's husband, who died in 1994, was named Russell Clare Meservey. Now, there's this guy named Al Hubin, who's a crime fiction scholar, and he actually founded the Armchair Detective magazine. He's got a reference book that confirms that the author of this 1953 paperback you have in your hands there was Russell Clare Meservey. So the Russell Meservey who wrote this single novel is the same guy who died in 1994. The problem, then, is this pulp author, Russ Meservey. The years just don't make sense. The guy started writing airplane pulp fiction about fighter pilots in 1929. So let's assume that he had to be at least in his 20s when he was doing that, but probably older. He was probably born in the 1800s, but let's be generous and say he was born in 1900. If it's the same guy, and I'm building a case that he's not, he would have married Lucille when he was 53 and she was 20. It's not impossible, but I'd say it's unlikely. That's basically a full generation difference.
Yeah.
Now, additional digging finds that the pulp magazine writer wrote some of his articles and stories under the name of H. Russell Meservey, whereas the paperback guy, as I just explained, was Russell Clare Meservey. Now, all of these factors, combined with this 13-year hiatus from writing between the end of the pulp writing and the publication of this paperback, make me nearly certain that the pulp author and the paperback author were different guys. Now, I have a theory based on nothing but my own gut instinct and my love of a good story, that the two writers were different people, but I think that they were father and son. The ages make sense, right? Dad wrote for the airplane pulps and eventually segued into hard-boiled crime, writing for Dime Detective. 13 years after Dad retires from writing, the son picks up the mantle, landing a one-book sale with the most prestigious publisher of paperback original novels, Fawcett Gold Medal. Maybe young Russ based the book off a draft or outline that his old man had created before he stopped writing. Maybe old Russ was alive and collaborated with his son, editing the novel or whatnot, to create Masquerade into Madness. It's all possible. All right, so here we go. I spent an evening researching names of Lucille's surviving family members and reaching out to people with the same name on Facebook to see if they could fill me in on the family's history. But Eric, I got no responses. The funeral home who handled Lucille's arrangements also has a Facebook page where they posted her obituary. I commented on there, offering my condolences and soliciting any family members to get in touch with me, but so far I've got no response. As such, I've kind of shot my research wad on this one, but I feel like I'm closer to understanding who Russ Meservey was before I pulled this old book off my shelf and started reading it the other night. I guess that's something.
This stuff is so frustrating because as we sit here in 2021, most of these authors are not only dead, but their immediate offspring have since passed as well. I think the grandchildren of these authors have just less and less interest in their grandparents' life work. These writers are becoming less popular by the hour, and it makes me wonder if anyone will makes me wonder if anyone will even be reading the Paperback Warrior content in like 20 years. Tom, you and I are no different than the authors in that respect. In our 70s and 80s, is anyone really going to give a crap about our 700 episodes of this podcast or the 20,000 reviews we post? We're kind of like one of those guys, right?
Yeah, I suppose. I suppose a lot of the stuff is just sort of fleeting. And I will say, though, that the Internet's made life easier, not harder, as far as doing this research. I could not imagine doing this research in 1989 about who this guy was. I would be at a total dead end or spending tons of time with microfiche in a public library.
Right, yep.
Right. So switching gears, we had an odd coincidence the other day. I bought an adventure novel called The Sky Block by Steve Frazee from 1953. Let me hand this to you. And the day it arrived, you sent me a review you wrote of a Steve Frazee Western. What do you know about this guy, Eric?
Yeah, that's something. So Steve Frazee was born in Salida, Colorado. And from what I understand, he began making major contributions to the Western pulp magazines. And he wrote a number of North American Northwestern tales that were published in Adventure. Not surprisingly, though, many of Frazee's novels have become major motion pictures. Using his experience as a heavy construction and mine worker, Frazee would include these elements in his books, things about the mining industry, and novels like Ghost Mine and Hidden Gold exhibit those kind of characteristics while offering high adventure in northwestern America. I've reviewed a handful of his books for the blog, and I was looking at those, and here's my thoughts on some of them. The book High Cage was published in 1957, and it was later adapted into a Paramount film in 1958 under the title High Hell. And the book is about an experienced miner who leads 4 men into the frozen Canadian Rockies to establish this mining camp. Unbeknownst to most of these men, though, a woman makes her way into the group, and man, that becomes a real problem. With the work stranding the miners for the winter, these hardworking men begin having cabin fever, and as you can imagine, they start lusting for the woman. It's a really good book that works like a suspenseful Western in a way. And this year I read another of the author's Western novels, which was called Many Rivers to Cross. It was published by Fawcett Gold Medal in 1959 and was later adapted into a film by MGM. The book is set in 1790 and stars an uncivilized mountain man named Gentry. After fighting off some Native Americans in rural Kentucky, Gentry receives a small flesh wound. After a young woman named Mary comes to his aid, she talks Gentry into returning to her home so she can nurse him back to health. Unfortunately, Mary lives with a clan of Irish drinkers, and the group begins planning for Mary and Gentry to become married. And of course, Gentry doesn't want to settle down for fearing that his troubadour lifestyle is going to end. But Mary has kind of pursues him with a sexual aggression. So it's kind of like this weird twist of Zane Grey and Ori Hitt. It was a really funny book, and I'm not sure how that translated into film, but I really enjoyed the book. I also read another of his novels, which was the 1957 Fawcett Gold Medal crime noir called Running Target. And that book featured an ensemble cast of characters that are combing this dense mountain range searching for 4 escaped prisoners. I didn't care for this book. I found that the author sort of beat around the bush with pages and pages of tasks like making coffee and camping and whatnot. And there's this constant bickering with the characters that just makes it dumb. Despite Mitchell Hooks, who did I believe Mitchell Hooks did the cover art, which was really great, there's really no reason to pursue this particular novel. And I've got a lot of Frazee novels that I really want to look at, especially the Skyblock. So are you going to read the Skyblock?
Well, do you have it?
I do not.
Okay, well, I may just give you mine since you're kind of covering Frazee. So the printing I have there that that I just handed to you is from Pyramid Books in 1958. Inside the cover, it says that this was Steve Frazee's first suspense novel. I imagine he may have written some Westerns before that. It's got an alluring cover depicting a man with a gun with an explosion happening behind him. It's about a young man named Vencel who grew up near this mountain called Blue Peak. As a boy, Vencel climbed the mountain, he fished the streams, he hunted on it. The mountain was basically his home. As an adult, Vencel returns to the mountain to find that some evil dude, or maybe group of dudes, has hidden a device inside the mountain with an electronic transmitter of some kind that can control the weather, which is ruining crops across America. Because Vencel knows the mountain better than anyone, he's recruited into a team of like army dudes, FBI agents, and the nation's top scientists to find and destroy this devastating weapon before it harnesses the weather and destroys mankind. It's a cool premise, kind of pulpy. It's called The Skyblock by Steve Frazee, and I'm willing to offer you this deal. How about this? Why don't I hold on to the book till like April?
Okay.
And because I do like the idea, and it's attractive to me, and we could do a bigger Steve Frazee thing if we both read some of his books. But if I haven't read this by April, I'm just going to give it to you to read and review. How about that?
Yeah, that's a deal, and I'm really hoping that your day job keeps you extremely busy in the next 2 months.
Right, yeah, that seems likely. Anyway, so let's do the feature. Why don't you play some music?
Our feature today is on multi-genre author Ralph Hayes, who wrote over 60 novels, Tom, for guys like us.
Yes.
Unlike most of the authors we feature, Ralph Hayes is still alive. At least I can find no record of him dying since I last corresponded with him in April of 2019 when he was 91 years old. As of 2 years ago, he was living in Michigan and still writing Westerns. And I also just saw that he has a new novel coming out in March of 2021 from Black Horse Westerns, called Return of the Buffalo Hunter. So it seems that he's still active even at age 93.
That's amazing.
Ralph was an attorney by trade in Michigan, apparently really successful, and he married a highly regarded artist. Her passion and interest in the arts inspired Hayes to relinquish his law practice in 1969 and move to Key West, Florida. In Key West, Hayes began a torrid affair with his typewriter, one that stuffed the paperback shelves with multiple series titles like The Hunter, Agent of Commonsec, Stoner, and Soldier of Fortune. In fact, Hayes created or contributed to 7 individual series, including the wildly popular Nick Carter Killmaster paperbacks. He's not an internet-savvy guy, so my correspondence with Ralph is via old-fashioned snail mail. We don't really do guests on our show here, so Tom, you'll need to help me out with the quotes from Ralph from my snail mail interview. Is that okay with you?
I was born for this role, Eric. Let me get into character here. All right, here we go. Let me do my best Ralph Hayes imitation.
Okay.
Go ahead, Eric. Ask me anything.
So, Ralph, tell me how you got started writing fiction.
I didn't start writing seriously until 1969. A story of mine originally appeared in Alfred Hitchcock Mystery Magazine in 1967. It was called The Gumdrop Affair. It was later included in 2 separate college textbook anthologies. I've sold almost 40 short stories to literary quarterlies, men's magazines, and mystery magazines.
A lot of authors rework short stories into full-length novels. Did you ever try that?
I would never try to broaden a short story tale into a novel length. Short stories are an art form apart and in no way inferior to the importance of the novel. On the other hand, when an editor asked me to cut a couple scenes from a novel, I later developed those scenes into short stories. Writer's Digest once asked me to do an article telling other writers how I went about it.
One thing that listeners should know about your work is that you often set your men's adventure novels in these really exotic locales, ranging from vigilante, globe-trotting adventurers to mercenaries. You really have a unique sense of realism within your writing.
I've been to East Africa twice. I've also been to South Africa, Egypt, Ethiopia, and Morocco. I've also been around Europe by both moped and car. I went to Hong Kong and Peru to visit Machu Picchu. All of this with my artist wife, who's now deceased, whose art is in private collections all over this country and Europe.
Your first series, and one that is continuing to this day, is a Western series called The Buffalo Hunter. It stars a hero named O'Brien. The first installment came out in 1970 and was called Gunslammer, which also was released as Secret of Sulphur Creek. That series encompasses 11 total novels, with another one on the way next month. How would you characterize the Buffalo Hunter series?
Oh, it's rugged, intimidating, rawhides. Can't read or write, but he speaks several Indian languages. He's really a perfect wild country survivalist.
From 1967 through the early 1980s, you wrote over 60 novels. The 1970s were a particularly productive era for you. Ralph, you launched and grew series titles including Buffalo Hunter, The Hunter, Check Force, Stoner, and Agent of Commonsec for familiar publishing houses like Manor, Leisure, Zebra. What's a book that you authored that you feel is a real favorite for you?
I'm particularly fond of a 1979 book entitled Hostages of Hell. Now, the book is based on a real-life terror attack on a U.S. embassy. My research for the book included actual correspondence with the U.S. ambassador in Khartoum.
By the early 1980s, I can see your writing reduced to just a few standalone novels, most done as historical romance pieces.
When publishing took a nosedive in the mid-'80s, we returned to Michigan, where I resumed my law career, but still doing some writing on the side.
I noticed by 1992 you began producing westerns again with 2 standalone paperbacks for Pinnacle. Just 7 years later, you would experience another productive era, penning westerns for the UK publisher Black Horse, an imprint of Robert Hale Publishing.
The recently published westerns at Robert Hale and Crowwood have been newly written novels, starting with The Tombstone Vendetta, which is about Wyatt Earp,
and the OK Corral. The Last Buffalo, Fort Revenge, and Coyote Moon form a trilogy of O'Brien the Buffalo Hunter stories that really make up one long saga. I suspect that Fort Revenge is about the best of that genre.
Ralph, you told me your favorite writers include Ernest Hemingway, Jane Austen, and the recently deceased Jean Le Carre. You tend to have a lot to say about what people perceive as genre fiction.
The idea that genre fiction is somehow inferior in quality to so-called mainstream fiction and it's not literary is artificial bullpucky. Mainstream is also a genre. Psychological studies, social issues, etc. are all genres, and most of that is not as entertaining as other genres. Entertainment is the primary objective of all fiction. The other, lesser goal being enlightenment, which should never dominate the story. If you have a cause to espouse, the proper literary form is an essay or a nonfiction book. In drama, all of Shakespeare's plays were genre. Jane Austen's novels are genre. Poe's stories are genre. All in this developed use of the word. The Sun Also Rises is genre, and The Old Man and the Sea is also, in my revised classification system. People who like to maintain the mainstream is superior notion would rank The Grapes of Wrath above Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, a love story or light romance, but it isn't. The love story is better, both in entertainment and enlightenment.
You have a diverse bibliography that includes period pieces, mystery, adventure, vigilante, romance, science fiction, and thriller, all thought-provoking and entertaining in their own right.
So let's dispense with mainstream and literary as a description of fiction and categorize all works as some kind of genre.
Now, the listener can find Eric's entire interview with the bibliography of Ralph Hayes at paperbackwarrior.com. So given all that, Eric, why don't you tell us what are some of your favorite Ralph Hayes books?
I'm going to start with my favorite, which is Buffalo Hunter. I've really loved all of these books, but my favorite of the Buffalo Hunter novels is one called Hellhole. It was originally published in 1973. In it, the series' main character, the Buffalo Hunter named O'Brien, he's fingered as the killer of two men and this young girl. Readers know that a gang of outlaws actually did the killing, but the law convicts O'Brien and condemns him to this dry and dusty prison. The book features O'Brien tangling with savage and mean outlaws, evil prison guards, the sadistic prison that's housing all of them. It's a prison novel, but also an escape adventure as O'Brien sets out to clear his name. Again, that one is called Buffalo Hunter Hellhole. My second favorite Ralph Hayes series is Stoner. It's a 1970s treasure hunting adventure starring a salvage expert named Mark Stoner. The series lasted only 4 books, and my favorite book of this series is called The Satan Stone. This one has Stoner attempting to smuggle this 1,000-carat diamond out of a South African mining prison. How the diamond is found, Stoner's job to retrieve it, and the heist itself is just really, really good. Clearly, Hayes was in his element with this novel, and it's absolutely one of the best novels of his career. Again, this is Stoner number 2, The Satan Stone. Another of my favorites is the Hunter series. It also ran in the 1970s and consisted of 5 total installments. All the ones I have read are great, but my favorite thus far is the second volume, which was called Night of the Jackals. The series stars big game hunter turned vigilante John Yard, and in this book, Yard and his partner Moses are brought into this rural Georgia military stockade to investigate an old friend's murder. It's here that they discover an ex-German officer is in charge of the stockade, and all of the black soldiers are being brutally beaten and killed. This book takes the action internationally from Georgia to Africa to Paris as the two heroes try to bring down this former Nazi. It's action-packed, and it has a military team-based combat feel, but also a dose of international espionage. Again, it's great, and it's called The Hunter number 2, Night of the Jackals. Tom, you've also read some Ralph Hayes novels too, right?
Yeah, so one of my favorite violent action series titles is the Soldier of Fortune series by Peter McCurtain. It's about this badass mercenary named Jim Rainey who flies off to various banana republics for paid combat missions. The British printings of the series were called Jim Rainey, Death Dealer, but the books are exactly the same. So even though the books bear McCurtain's name on the cover, he outsourced the writing of many of the installments. So in installments number 4 through 9 were written by Ralph Hayes under Peter McCurtain's name during the years 1977 and 1978. So I reviewed Soldier of Fortune number 6, Ambush at Doradi Wells, a few years ago. It was written by Ralph under Peter's name, and it was awesome. It takes place in Kenya and Ethiopia. An airplane crashes in the jungle, and the plane is just filled to the brim with guns. Jim Rainey is hired to put a team together to go into the jungle to recover the weapons. It's filled with action, very violent. In one scene, Rainey actually kills an African by plunging a screwdriver into his attacker's ear canal.
Ooh.
Yeah, so it's definitely not for the faint of heart, but I can definitely recommend it. Again, the book is Soldier of Fortune number 6, Ambush at Doradi Wells, by Ralph Hayes, writing as Peter McCurtain. It has not been digitized or reprinted, so you need to find an old paperback from 1977 if you want to read it.
Anyway, that's our feature on Ralph Hayes. I think we both have a lot of respect for his work, and if you like exciting adventure stories and exotic locations, you're probably going to enjoy his work as well. Without being arrogant, the best starting point for Ralph Hayes is to simply visit paperbackwarrior.com and click on the author's tag on the right-hand side of the screen. It's going to bring up a full interview with Hayes, as well as a really deep dive into his bibliography. I've researched almost every title he's written, and I have it in an organized list there for you to browse. As time goes on, more and more people have responded to that article and have added even more books that I wasn't aware of. So it's an ongoing list, and it gets edited frequently. Tom, why don't you go ahead and do a review for us?
Sure. My review today is the book Nightwalker by Donald Hamilton. Now, you're going to recognize the name Donald Hamilton from his Matt Helm series of spy adventure novels that began in 1960 with Death of a Citizen. Now, before that, he churned out a respectable library of standalone westerns, mysteries, and thrillers, including Nightwalker from 1954. This may sound familiar to you because the book was reprinted by Hardcase Crime in 2006, and it actually remains in print today. Both the original cover and the Hardcase Crime reprint depict a man with bandages wrapped around his head like a mummy and a woman in distress with him. The paperback opens with Dave Young hitchhiking his way to Norfolk, Virginia. He gets picked up by a stranger named Larry, who knocks Dave unconscious with a tire iron in the car. Dave awakens in a hospital bed with his head wrapped in bandages. The nurses are under the impression that Dave is actually Larry, and they claim that he was in this car accident alone. It quickly becomes clear that Larry staged the accident with the intent of switching clothing and identities with Dave. Now, while Dave is still sedated, he's discharged from the hospital with his face wrapped in bandages and sent home with Larry's estranged wife, Elizabeth. So he's setting you up for this, that you think it's going to be one of these identity switching novels, and then the author throws a curveball when Larry's wife, Elizabeth, admits to Dave that this is her first kidnapping. I'm not going to spoil the hidden agenda here that has swept poor Dave into all this intrigue, but it is compelling as hell. This is one of those novels like Hamilton's Line of Fire that is filled with revelations as the story unfolds. It's the kind of twisty story that I think Alfred Hitchcock would have really loved. Dave's core dilemma is this. Larry is this pillar in the community, and no one's going to believe that Larry would have staged an unprovoked attack on Dave, a stranger he just picked up on the road. What would the police think if told this story by a man wearing Larry's clothing and wristwatch? Dave figures correctly that having done nothing wrong, the unlikely situation makes him look guilty of something. There's also the mystery of what the hell happened to the real Larry. Beyond that, there's not much I want to tell you about Nightwalker, other than you should get a copy and definitely read it. It's a lot of fun with tons of plot twists along the way. It's really a thinking man's novel of suspense, and it's one you deserve. Hardcase Crime was very smart to reprint Nightwalker. Some other enterprising reprint houses should take the initiative and get Hamilton's other standalone books back in print. I would especially like to recommend Line of Fire and Assassins Have Starry Eyes as books that have not seen the light of day since they were printed, but they're both excellent novels. Again, this guy Donald Hamilton is a national treasure, and he should never, ever be out of print. The book, though, I'm reviewing and just reviewed, so you can write it down again, is Nightwalker by Donald Hamilton. So, Eric, why don't you go ahead and do your review?
As I mentioned earlier, I'm going to review the 1955 crime noir They All Ran Away, written by Edward S. Ahrens. The book stars a rather interesting character named Barney Forbes, and here's what you need to know about him. He was an MP in the Army. After service, he became a New York detective. It was during his time in the NYPD that Forbes experienced the sudden and tragic death of his young bride. Forbes leaves law enforcement and pursues an education and career as an attorney. In the opening pages, readers learn that Forbes' new career path hasn't quite panned out. He doesn't have any clients. The rent's due, and he's got no money. Thankfully, another law practice in Forbes' building throws him a bone. They know that Forbes is a bit of a badass, so they hire him to assist one of their clients. You see, this wealthy man named Malcolm Hunter has gone missing in his small mountain lake community of Omega. His brother Jan is kind of this deadbeat, and he relies on Malcolm to spoon-feed him thousands of dollars each month. But with Malcolm gone, the purse strings are sewn shut, and Jan doesn't really like that. So he's hired the family estate's firm to find Malcolm. So in comes Forbes to the rescue. Just like with The Net and Gift of Death, all which are reviewed on paperbackwarrior.com, I thought this was another quality crime noir penned by Ahrens. There's so much atmosphere with the rural lake houses, the big Victorian-style houses, the boat docks, and the town's cast of eccentric characters. There's two beauties for Forbes to contend with while searching for this mysterious Malcolm character. The narrative even leaves the States for a moment and journeys up into rural Canada. At just under 150 pages, this book is jammed with suspenseful private eye tropes and a deep core mystery. I loved it, and I think you will too. Again, this one is called They All Ran Away by Edward S. Ahrens. And I think that about wraps us up. Why don't you send us off?
Okay, good. And thus concludes another episode of the Paperback Warrior podcast. Join us next week for another action-packed episode of vintage paperback discussion. In the meantime, visit our blog at paperbackwarrior.com for daily reviews of old paperbacks and support the show through a PayPal donation. We have a link in the upper right-hand corner of the desktop version of the site. On behalf of Eric, this is Tom saying be cool, and we will see you next week.